Hello, I'm Torrin Walker. Welcome to episode 10 of the Black Male Study Sessions. This is a series of discussions and roundtables focused on addressing the issues affecting Black men and boys. The Black Male Study Sessions is sponsored by the African American Men's Historical Society. The AMHIS is a Black American men's intellectual society focused on the preservation and environment of Black men. Go to amhis.org to learn more and visit their Substack at amhis.substack.com. During his State of the Union address on January 8, 1964, President Lyndon Baines Johnson proposed legislation that would expand the federal government's role in education and health care and poverty reduction strategies. This legislation came to be known as the War on Poverty, which was seen as the spiritual successor to Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal enacted to counter the mass unemployment, homelessness, and social upheaval of the Great Depression. In that inaugural address, Johnson stated, "Our aim is not only to relieve the system of poverty, but to cure it, and above all, to prevent it." One of the major battlegrounds of that war was alleviating chronic poverty in Black American communities. And one of the guiding battle plans of that fight was a government study officially titled The Negro Family, The Case for National Action, written in 1965 by then Assistant Secretary of Labor Daniel Patrick Moynihan. That study came to be known as the Moynihan Report. The effect of the war on poverty on Black communities was the effective removal of Black males from the home, creating a climate of hostility to Black men by Black women, a lack of male mentorship for Black children, and the disruption of the overall Black community. And I wanted to unpack some of these issues as to why we got here with Professor Tommy J. Curry. Most of you know Professor Tommy J. Curry is one of the seminal authors of Black Male Studies. He is the MPH Personal Chair of Africana Philosophy of Black Male Studies, Department of Philosophy at the University of Edinburgh School of Philosophy, Psychology, and Language Sciences. And he is most known for being the author of the book The Man Not: Race, Class, Genre, and the Dilemmas of Black Manhood, winner of the 2018 American Book Award, and a foundational text in the field of Black Male Studies. Professor Curry, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, sir. How are you?
Doing well, doing well. Thank you again for taking time out of your busy schedule to have this conversation. I always appreciate it when you're able to come through.
No, I always appreciate the invitation, brother.
All right, so let's get right into it. How did this legislation that was supposed to remedy the conditions in Black America open the door for them to get worse?
Well, the thing that a lot of people don't understand about the Moynihan Report uh, is that it is the product of decades of research on Black communities. So, what Daniel P. Moynihan does in his report on the Negro family is actually try to accumulate the cutting edge research on the Black American personality. So the report centers on two major aspects of Black families and Black communities. The first is that discrimination in the United States has psychological effects on Black people. He largely relies on the work of Mitchell and what later became known as the marshmallow test to measure delayed gratification, suggesting that because Black men didn't have the same kind of economic and social opportunities that other groups have had, especially poor Black men, that they couldn't delay gratification. So they didn't see the benefits of pursuing education like their Black female counterpart. The second thing that I think, and this is what I see people debating more on social media, is this question of the matriarchal family or the female led household. Now, that piece becomes a little bit more difficult because it's a highly politicized argument in the Black community. Most Black feminists and pop culture kind of pundits articulate the Moynihan Report as saying that because the Black community is matriarchal, that's responsible for the failures of the Black race in the United States. And they see it as scapegoating Black women for the failures of the race, where patriarchy becomes the solution, so to speak. That's a half truth, right? So the debates over the Moynihan report actually failed to trace out the assumptions of Moynihan. And what ends up happening is we have kind of an argument about identity politics rather than the social science that he was actually using. So what Monahan was saying, and this is on the basis of people like John Dollard and Thomas Pettigrew, was that discrimination was so severe for black men that it eliminated any ability for them to actually be heads of households, right? So take, for example, like if you actually read the Monahan report, he constantly cited in Thomas Pettigrew's book, A Profile of the Negro American. And in that book, Thomas Pettigrew actually argues that employment discrimination has made it more difficult for poorly educated black men to get secure employment than poorly educated black women. So the effect of that was that poor black men did not have the ability to form typical American households where they were the head of household and allowed for stable family units. This is the same thing that E. Franklin Frazier discussed when he was studying black families, that black men would actually have to leave cities to find employment elsewhere, and this would create the absence of the father figure, right? Now, Thomas Pettigrew didn't pull this out of thin air. He didn't just make it up. He actually got it from a white boy named John Dollard. He was educated at the University of Chicago, and in the early 1930s, he was a professor at Yale University. Now, he wrote a book called Casting Class in a Southern Town, and if you'd allow me, I'd like to just read a quote from this because I
Please.
think it really contextualizes how much people misunderstand and misrepresent what's going on in the Moynihan report for their own ideas. Okay. So Donald actually says this. He says, look, when Jim Crow made its appearance towards the end of the 19th century, it may be speculated that it was the Negro male who was most humiliated thereby. The male was most likely to use public facilities, which rapidly became segregated once the process began. And just as important, segregation and the submissiveness it exacts is surely more destructive to the male than the female personality. So keeping the Negro in his place can be translated as keeping the Negro male in his place. The female was not a threat to anyone. Unquestionably, those events worked against the margins of a strong father figure, right? So when we're looking at the Moynihan report, we have to understand that the claims about the matriarchal household does not just appear. Like Moynihan's not making this statement just out of thin air, right? He's saying that this happens because the basis of black people in the United States come about because the system of segregation has deliberately targeted black men. Now, what's important is that John Dollard makes the exact same claim back in the 1930s. Dollars fundamentally believes that to be a black man in Jim Crow was about making sure that black men could not have any kind of economic potential, right? And to make sure that black men could not intermarry. So his whole book is about how Jim Crow segregation was about making sure black men knew their inferior position, whereas black women, because white men had unfettered access to them sexually, could walk across the line, the color line more freely. So whereas a white man can have sex and give gifts to to black women, if a black man even thought about looking at a white woman or having a sexual desire for her, he was immediately lynched. Right. So we have to understand that Monahan is building from a history of white sociology that's relying on people like Pettigrew, people like John Dollard, and even people like Mitchell. Because Mitchell's argument, again, was that because black men could not see the long gains of education, that you would never be able to have black men make long-term sacrifices, or short-term sacrifices, excuse me, for long-term gains. So the Moynihan report talks about female-headed households, but only insofar as they're a product. And this is what's constantly missing from the discussion because it's politicized only insofar as they are a product of black men, of lower class black men specifically, being discriminated against throughout Jim Crowism, right? He doesn't believe that this is the case for middle class black households, which is why I find it ironic that you have a bunch of academics politicizing the Moynihan report about black female led households when he's very specifically talking about poor black people. Now the question of patriarchy that black feminists continue to harp on. it becomes somewhat anachronistic in this sense, right? Because it's aspirational. There were no black patriarchs during this period of time. The whole Moynihan report, as well as John Dolan and Thomas Pettigrew, which is constantly cited in it, are saying that listen, segregation and racism was so bad that poor black men did not have the ability to be patriarchs or lead households. Remember, I spoke about this earlier last year when we discussed domestic violence. One of the things that was well thought during this period of time in the 1960s by University of Chicago educated sociologists, and I'm thinking here, of course, about LeBeau's book, Tally's Corner, is that poor black men did not deserve the respect of their spouses, right? So Thomas Pettigrew, for instance, says that black women actually resented black men who were unable to care for their family, which was more typical of bourgeois family arrangements and even middle class black family arrangements, right? You have people like LeBeau saying the same thing, where he gives the account of a woman who beats her husband because she didn't think he was a real man. He couldn't provide for her. He couldn't lead the household. So throughout white sociology, you've always had this emphasis on what we would now call the gender wars between black men and black women. But those things don't start as the product of a political difference in the 1960s. These ideas are manifested throughout the 20th century when you have white sociologists going all the way back to Hannah Arendt, who wrote Soul Side, saying that because black men were not real men, and this is the terminology they used, black women demonstrated hostility and lack of respect for them. So this, and I'm not saying that that's true, because remember, this is from the lens of white researchers. But what I'm saying is that what's happening in social media, what's happening over Twitter, what's even happened in the academy is you've taken one particular interpretation of the Moynihan report, and that becomes your Cliff Notes version for the test. You don't go back and read Thomas Pettigrew. You're not reading Mitchell's arguments on delayed gratification. You're not reading Dollard, and you're saying, oh, this is all about the female-led household. But you've missed the whole part where these white sociologists are arguing, well, Jim Crow and economic discrimination is decimating black men's ability to even find work. So they can't be productive members within the household. And then they psychologize them, saying that because they can't contribute economically, the black woman disrespects them and attacks them, right? So going so far as people like Wolfgang and Farrakuni saying that black women kill and beat black men within the household because of this dynamic, and black men don't have any incentive to complete education. So whereas black women complete education and become more degreed, black men turn away, which is why Moynihan says they should join, say, the army or things of that, because they don't see, they can't delay gratification and see the long-term benefits of pursuing a college degree. Now that complexity is lost, and what ends up happening is we're having fights with each other about racist social science that neither one of us authored. Right? Black male sociologists like Robert Staples didn't support the Moynihan report. He didn't believe that you can reduce family organization to the single cause of black people's economic and political failures. He thought white supremacy and racism was responsible for that. You have numerous people, like even Dorothy Hyatt, who published or who was quoting the report to Roosevelt before the Moynihan report, where she even talks about the discrimination of black men and the dehumanization and targeting of black men, and how part of the civil rights gains is to give black men respect because they've been dehumanized. And people now, she of course she was middle class. She had a very Christian and nuclear family outlook, but the conversation that black people are attending to the specific discrimination and targeting of black men was nothing that was gender related. It was what the race thought during this period of time, given the science. So it's a misrepresentation that's completely anachronistic to attack each other. And I see this on social media. Black people to attack each other for a report that they didn't author, and most people certainly don't understand.
I want to go through the key conclusions of the Moynihan report. It's a very comprehensive study, but there are four key conclusions. I'm going to go through the first two here.
Mm,
Um, the Moynihan report said that the condition of the black community and the economic condition of the black community came down to four key things. The first was the legacy of slavery and racism. The report
mm,
emphasized that historical oppression, particularly slavery and systemic racism, disrupted traditional family structures and continued to affect the social and economic stability of African American families. The second one was family structure, as you mentioned before, was central to understanding black poverty. The Moynihan
Yes.
report argued that the high rate of single mother households in the black community was a central factor contributing to poverty, social disorganization, and inequality. He claimed that what he coined a tangle of pathology had developed, rooted in the breakdown of the nuclear family. Now, I just want to stop at those 2 points right there because nothing in either one of those points is anything inherently that says that anything about black women or black mothers is inherently bad. This is just laying out the conditions for why things are the way they are. So, my question to you is how did the Moynihan report get interpreted through the decades as being anti black women?
Well, I mean, I think there's a few things because I do believe the Moynihan Report is anti-black, right? The problem is that the culture of poverty arguments that are starting by people like Oscar Lewis presuppose that there are certain cultural arrangements that differ from the white race. That means that certain racial groups are not viable, right? So think of it like this. Descriptively, you're right. Those things don't sound like anything controversial. But if you understand the science behind it, you would say, okay, black people live in a cultural arrangement where poverty, delayed gratification, or the inability to delay gratification, and deviance grow, because that's what these cultural poverty theorists were arguing. Okay, the assumption behind that, though, right, that we have a different configuration of family that's responsible for us not progressing politically, completely overlooks the role that contemporary racism have. Because remember, Pettigrew is saying, look, black men suffer from economic discrimination that produces many of these psychological attitudes where they don't value education. But that's not true. Black men fought against segregation. They fought for education. So you're still dealing with these very kind of white centered views of black deficiency and deficit. And I think that's where the issue comes in. Now, listen, the problem that I think we are dealing with today is because we have one particular interpretation of this story, which comes dominantly from black feminism. So black feminists look at that and say, you're saying that the pathology and downfall of the race is the fault of black women. And to a certain extent, Moynihan, Pettigrew, etc., do make that claim. But the claim is on a cultural basis that because black women are black led households, are black households are led by black women. This produces deviance. It produces homosexuality, according to these racist theories, and it produces criminality. Right? That's what's happening during this period of time. But they exclude the fact that black men are structurally isolated as well. It's not the call for patriarchy on behalf of black men. It's the same kind of deficit theories that the people have been writing about since the 1920s concerning black communities. And that's what's being isolated, right? That's what's being forgotten. Black feminism's using it as a political point, where in reality, it's an anti-black point that ridicules the position that black men have historically been put in because they're not white men.
I just find it interesting that first of all, the Moynihan report is very comprehensive, like I said, and it takes a lot of time to sit down and actually read through everything and basically to interpret it. I'm just fascinated by the fact that that one particular part of the report and part of its conclusions was taken completely out of context, or all these different points of view were added to it without anybody really engaging with the text itself.
Well, but I mean, listen, this is what happens to the academy, right? I mean, is Moynihan comprehensive? Certainly for its time in the 1960s, it was a comprehensive document based on white social science. Okay. But what I'm trying to highlight though is that we're using a document that most black sociologists disagree with, right? Like, sure, we know that single mother households tend to be poor, but that's because there's one person in it. It's not because of the unique condition or pathology of black women. Monahan presupposed that black culture, because it was affected by segregation and racism, was fundamentally lacking. It was deficient in some way. And then he created this different model saying, well, we need to repair it by making it more in line with white family structures. The background of that, however, is the attack, decimation, and humiliation of black men, because they were the ones that were excluded in a Jim Crow society from being productive members of society. That's why people like Monahan actually say, listen, to keep the Negro in his place, right, is actually meant to keep the black man in his place. So what we've done as usual is miss the fact that black men have been targeted in a very specific and deliberate way, and that this has a direct effect on the outcomes for the community at large. We've ignored the political economy of the doctrine and focused on the identity politics of the doctrine.
Let's get into the practice of poverty legislation. Social programs under the War on Poverty were, for the most part, administered by white liberals, and that administration was, in many cases, disruptive to the potential of black men and black women to even create stable families. In
Hmm.
many cities like Chicago and Oakland and other places, black single mothers were penalized if social workers found evidence of an adult male living in subsidized housing. There was a very
Absolutely.
famous movie that came out at the time called Claudine, came out around 1973, I believe, that highlighted this problem. It was with Diane Carroll and James Earl Jones. That basically one of the main plot points was this woman who was trying to create a relationship with a man who was, she was a housekeeper, he was a garbage man, and she had a lot of different, about 4 or 5 children in her household, boys and girls. But there was several scenes in that movie where every time a social worker would come by who was a white liberal woman, he either had to run out of the window or hide in the closet. That was something
Yeah.
that actually was documented at that time. Can you talk a little bit about benevolent, the benevolent malevolence of some of the white liberals who said they wanted to benefit black communities, but this is what ended up happening, the way it was implemented?
Well, look, I mean, but listen, these lots of the discussions around this period of time, around the absence of black men, was that it was forced, it was legislated, right? And here's what's crazy, right? So, in 1963, you had a report on the problems of Negro women. It was commissioned by under John F. Kennedy. Okay, in that report, Dorothy Hyatt was very clear that you could not protect black women unless you repaired the status of black men his position in the community in the community. Now, remember, Moynihan comes about a few years later, right? 65. So what ends up happening in Moynihan is he completely overlooks the fact that black women are saying that black men and women are interdependent. He thinks that it's purely the structure. So what you've done is you've then introduced a policy that tries to keep black men separate from black women, and then have black women be completely reliant on the state for their livelihood and their livelihoods, right? So the effect of this policy was to remove father figures. It was to remove the idea that black men are viable members of the community. It was to increase the susceptibility that the black community had to negative stereotypes and associations of black masculinity and black maleness with deviance, right, and criminality. And it allowed us to talk about a black community without the need for black men. So this is why I'm always telling people that and this is what I find interesting in the academy as well, is black people tend to have a much stronger tolerance for mythology as the guiding basis of research and interpretation than other groups of people. And what I mean by that specifically is that given the position that we've endured in the United States, there's a tendency that we have to internalize and think with negative stereotypes where we become exceptions to the rule rather than a general consolidation of positive value for the whole group. And this is particularly important in this case because black academics either are middle class or aspire to be middle class in the United States. So as I talk about in The Man Not, there's this need to distance themselves from a problem population, which is what they see poor black men as. So in removing black men from households, they accept that's what's needed. They accept that the basis by which we could better ourselves and actually have stable communities don't require black men. But that's not a conclusion on the basis of any sociological study or understanding. That's a conclusion based in the reality by which the poverty that black people suffered in and the state assistance that was offered to single mothers, single black mothers, comes with the caveat that black men have to be absent. So the question of black male absenteeism is not formulated purely on black male choice. It's formulated on state incentives that want black men to be absent. And this plays several roles. It reinforces the structural poverty of the black community. And also it takes away the idea that black men are active participants or even could be participants, much less leaders of black resistance against a system of white supremacy. So this is engineered. It's part of domestic colonization. It's part of the resocialization apparatus of the black community at large. And it solidifies the structural position that black men have had within black communities as being considered problems, deviants, and unworthy and useless to the overall health of our people. So I think we have to be very careful when we talk about these kinds of histories without having a critical eye.
Just to do a little house cleaning, first of all, thank you for tuning in to the Black Male Study Sessions. The Black Male Study Sessions is sponsored by the African American Men's Historical Society. AMHIS is a Black American Men's Intellectual Society focused on the preservation, history, and empowerment of Black men. Go to amhis.org to learn more and visit their Substack at amhis.substack.com. Dr. Curry, I want to dive a little bit deeper into what you just said. You mentioned the fact that some of these policies were put in place to basically remove black men from the family structure and also remove them from being in positions of power or even being in positions of resistance or potential resistance.
Mhm.
Can you open that up a little bit more and talk a little bit about why that was so important?
Well, I mean, I think it was important for a lot of different reasons. I mean, the most obvious, and this is what current research talks about, is the economic stability of black households. Black men are major contributors to the economic stability of black households. I think politically, though, there's a larger point there, considering what we know Dorothy Hyatt was discussing, in her report in '63, right? Hyatt thought that the black community could only advance if black men were considered important to it. If they weren't seen as street men, so to speak, that they were active roles of fathers, husbands, and they played a role in the political future and contributions of the whole society. You see, in the mid 1960s, there was not the same idea that we have today, right? You didn't have black female leaders necessarily saying that to be a black man meant you were patriarchal. This is a post 1970s, 1980s kind of rhetoric. Because previously to that, before black feminism, you can't find a quote in any social scientific document or even, I don't even find a mention of it. And I've been researching this for almost a decade of black men being referred to as patriarchs. So it means that the association with male domination and black males is a relatively recent invention of academics and not of black activists, be they male or female. Given that reality, the removal of black men from households, right, functions as a way to consolidate the power of white supremacy because there's no messaging of resistance, there's no messaging of dissent coming from black men. And I think that that explains not only the reasons that we have such negative views about black men that we're currently fighting today, but it also explains the proliferation of a certain kind of black feminist ideology among middle class black people that can't really be explained in the uptake of feminist ideology by other groups. So take, for example, this, right? When anytime that we talk about black people, and we mean this academically in activist spaces on social media, the first kind of interpretive lens that's presented is black feminism. Now think about this. When we have any other conversation in the world, even about women, in a majority white society, white people don't necessarily start with feminism. They can start with economic problems. They can start with political underrepresentation. They could start with, God knows, international relations. There's tons of different things that affect how the dominant group interpret their reality. But with black people, it's almost always single-minded. It's a question of how black men perform, how black men participate, and how black men can be blamed or put in antagonistic relationships with black women. And we saw this completely during the period of the election with Donald Trump. Even when black men were overwhelmingly supportive of a Democratic president or candidate, though I don't necessarily think they should have been, they were blamed as supporting Trump. And they definitely shouldn't have supported him. So the views that we have are dictated by the absence of black men that's being conveyed and socialized into us, both academically through black feminism and socially through state intervention and tyranny and violence, right? So we have to, what we see now as the gender wars, Torian, are more so the product of decades of socialization. These are not naturally occurring phenomena. No group of people naturally grow up hating one another, especially when they're birthed from one another. And what we've done is we've used societal conditions and racism to dictate what we actually think the divisions and the boundaries between black men and black female interests are. And that's perpetuated by policy, right? And now we're in a situation where the government's bringing back segregation in a very real sense. So now everybody's the same. And we don't have black solidarity by an extent that will allow us to actually benefit from confronting things together because we're still trying to divide each other and take each other apart. So the Moynihan report is just a symbol of that. It's a remnant of the kinds of ideas that said that there was not an interest necessarily for black men and women to be together, rather just imitate white structures. And the removal of black men from households based on welfare or social work policies in the United States was a way to justify and rationalize the elimination of black men from communities because black women who were single mothers saw more economic and social capital being gained with the absence of black men by their reliance on the government rather than black men actually being in their communities and their households.
I'm taking a look at some data right now and some of the effects of some of these policies that you mentioned. When it came to getting resources or benefits from the state and federal governments for housing assistance, AFDC, WIC, welfare,
Hmm.
resources were for the most part shifted towards women with dependent children. A
Yes.
woman, a woman with dependent children couldn't get benefits, as I said earlier, in some cities if she had a man in the house, but she
Yeah.
could get benefits according to the number of children she had.
Yes.
Essentially, the government made it more lucrative to have children without a man in the house. But living in the United States, American culture says that a man should be a provider. Um, what you saw from this was women, single mothers who were overburdened with child rearing, overburdened with trying to make ends meet financially, and also trying to be basically the bedrock of raising children by being taking on the role of the mother and also in some cases the father because a lot of times there was no male figure in the house at all.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
what would that do? That obviously has to do something to someone's psyche when you have all that pressure on top of you and you don't have a counterpart to help with household duties like child rearing and also taking care of the bills. What does that do to someone's psyche?
Oh, well, I mean, it's, listen, black people have been structurally positioned to experience every form of um, depression of trauma possible, right? It creates the view that black women are in it by themselves. I think it breeds resentment, and I think we see contemporary expressions of this all the time. I remember when the young woman from was it Abbott Elementary was divorced, right? And there was all this discussion because she married a white man initially, and there was a question of were there good enough or were there enough good black men that could marry her. So what we do then is we say, well, look, these class differences between black men and women, the fact that black men don't graduate with as many degrees as black women, somehow determine whether or not black men are suitable partners, right? So just think about that. If you keep removing black men and you grow up in a culture that says, look, they're just an appendage more so than a necessary aspect of parenting or of partners, then you've created a system where you don't see one another as necessary. And it affects their attitudes. I mean, in fact, there were studies on this in the ethnographies from the 1920s and 30s that very clearly stated that black people had preferences, that even black women had claimed preferences of wanting to be with white men or to be with a man purely for financial benefit. So they didn't see anything. And this is what black people were criticized during the period of time for, right? As if these were natural attitudes rather than class effects or consequences of poverty, was that black men don't become necessary for the happiness of black women or necessary for the stability of black families. So black women, of course, experience high rates of depression, high rates of trauma, higher rates of suicide ideation compared to other groups, apathy. Right? These are all things that are produced by environments because of the level of stresses that black women experience. And we, of course, know how this affects birth rates, how this affects parenting. There's lots of things that affect it. I think the most dangerous aspect of all the things that we're talking about and all the debates that we have on social media is how black people internalize their own hatred by hating other groups within them. So we're not having a conversation just about black women. What we're talking about is when you have a system that is going to commit black families to poverty and mandates that black men cannot be in households, that it reproduces generationally and structurally an apparatus that says that there's a higher quality of life in the poverty of the state than there is in the aspiration of black families and black communities. And that's the piece that has not been questioned. Because simultaneously with the removal of black men from households, you have a rise in certain ontological explanations of that removal and that say that these same poor black men are dangerous. And Tori, what's strange to me is that you have this policy aspect that's coming about in the 60s and 70s, right? That's attacking poor black men. And then in the areas that I study, like subcultural violence theory and criminology, you have the same targeting of these poor black men that are no longer needed in households, said to be dangerous, not able to assimilate, and rapists. So the policy that's being created also is giving the credence to the theories that are being implemented and appealed to justify the policies. People like Lynn A. Curtis, who is charged of eliminating urban poverty and crime, made the argument that poor black men were actually sexually aggressive, criminal, and rapists and deviant. So you had a policy that says, well, look, you can't have black men in the home, so that means that they have to be out on the street. If they're out on the street or doing something else that's trying to make money to help their home situation in life, they're going to be claimed to be criminals. Well, that means that this is their personality type. You see, out of the 60s and 70s, people start psychologizing black people. So they started psychologizing poor black women, saying that this is where the myth of the super predator comes about, right? That these poor black women were going to reproduce with poor black men who are already had chronological personality types. So what did they have to do to poor black women? They needed to sterilize them, right? This is what Dorothy Roberts' work talks about. Well, then what do these white criminologists say about poor black men? You got to incarcerate or kill them. That's why they're super predators because they don't have any kind of value system. They don't have a home life. They don't have relationships, right? This is the same nonsense that Bell Hooks says, right? That black men don't care about their lives because they don't build normative social structures. They can't delay gratification, right? That's what she says in We're Real Cool, that tons of intelligent black men are in prison because they can't delay gratification. So you have people that are thought to be a criminal by personality type. So the only solution is to eliminate them and to make sure that black women can't reproduce with them. You see, these systems in the United States are deliberate. They're not happenstance. They didn't accidentally pop up. The toxicity that we see exhibited almost every day on social media is a direct product of the Jim Crow society and the anti-black racism that's been fanned and fueled and grown and cultivated by academic and activist sentiments that tries to pit the black community against one another. And we know this is the case because anytime you have a data-based or evidence-based conversation about how violence operates in the community, these same individuals, these same actors, these same authors have to lie all forms of data because they need us to believe that black men were either not useful to the black community and black family, or that black men are and actually dangerous to the black community and black family. Did I lose you, Tori?
No, no, I'm right here. I was just waiting for you to finish.
Yeah. I was landing on that.
Okay. Um, Also, before we move on, I just want to let people know we're going to have a brief Q&A with Dr. Curry. If anybody has a question, Um, Now's the time to shoot me your DMs or put a request up so I can see you. But we're going to move on because I want to ask you about the second part of this phenomenon, Dr. Curry.
Mm,
Um, if you have daughters who grow up with no fathers,
mm,
if you have sons who become directionless with no fathers or no male role models, um, if you have a black family structure that becomes rootless with no discipline and no order, what's the end result of that going to be?
Well, I mean, the evidence is split on this question, right? Because on the one hand, we know that there may be an absence of nuclear black families in the sense that white cultures have nuclear white families with marriage, but you still have black men that participate in their children's lives. You still have extended family units where black men socially father, children who have lost their father to premature death or incarceration. So I think that I always think there are black male role models in these communities. That being said, there is substantial evidence suggesting that the absence of fathers generally, but the absence of black fathers, do make a difference in terms of the educational and economic outcomes of children. You know, families or children that benefit from both parents, tend to have better educational outcomes, tend to strive harder, in terms of their economic ambitions, etc. But again, what I always caution people to is that the data tells a very complicated story as well as history, right? And that history is, yes, single mother households in the black community tend to produce worse outcomes than two parent households, but that's not necessarily a racial finding. It's also a class based finding, right? It's not that the culture of all these black women are necessarily bankrupt, right? However, because we live in a culture that demonizes black male intervention and presence, right? We do have a strain of thinking in our communities that would have us believe that the presence of black men are in fact dangerous, right? And I want to just say something about that. I went to a job interview once at a small college in Kentucky, um, and during the interview, one of the administrators just blatantly said, "Well, Bell Hooks tells us that it's better for black men," and this was direct quotes, right? It's better for black men who are abusive, to not be in households with women and children than for them to be present there. And and I was kind of taken aback by this story because
Hmm.
I said, okay, well, given that I studied child abuse and child sexual abuse, I said, well, listen, the abusive parent generally shouldn't be around the children, but in black households, depending on what kind of abuse you're talking about, right? If you're talking about physical abuse or neglect, etc., that often happens from women. It happens from mothers. Women tend to spend more time with children and have more abuse. Often men, especially black men, act as deterrents to the abuse of their biological child by women. So I was like, I don't know exactly what you're trying to get from me. I was like, I believe in science. And this person was like, well, Bell Hooks says X, right? So I think the question that you're asking lands very much on these kind of cultural assumptions. Black children do fare better with both parents. Um, but that doesn't necessarily just have to be a black man because the research says that even in black same-sex families, two people matter more than one. But the rules by which we interpret black reality always tend towards pathology, right? So two-headed households across the spectrum tend to produce better results. But when it comes to black people, this seems to be the explanation for crime, for sexual orientation, for deviance, etc., hypersexuality, etc., etc., etc. And I think that comes from the fact that we've internalized and we've not questioned the relationship that we've put in family structure and outcomes, that when it becomes black people, it becomes unique and specific, right? Rather than the same effect that we find across the board for multiple groups. And again, this goes back to what I was saying about what was happening during Jim Crow, right? Like the American psyche. is not cultivated just from objective thinking, right? It's cultivated with a resistance to ideas and an interpretive lens that is specifically anti-black male. So when you have people say we don't need black men in homes, that black men are dangerous in homes, that even if black men are present, it somehow increases the risk of aggression. These are talking points that have very, very little evidence. And they're talking points that ignore the general structure of Jim Crowism and segregation. Remember, what Dollar said was very clear, right? That segregation is a caste situation where black men can't be as expressive as black women in it, right? That there's antagonism from black women that's much more tolerated than the antagonism from black men, because when black men are antagonistic towards systems, it either comes with threats of social violence or sexual violence in the white person's mind. So while black women are still limited in how they could react to the society or revolt, black men are absolutely crucified from that. So what we see is a kind of post-crucifixion apparatus operating in the United States. The absence of black men is thought to be evidence of black men's social and political failure as true citizens of the United States, whereas every other group of men, be they white, be they Asian, etc., seem to be really viable partners. And we've used that stigma to interpret the problems, the disadvantages that black men suffer. Until we kind of get out of that and start saying that, listen, there are rules by which social structures, black homes, like white homes or other homes, are advantaged or disadvantaged within United States society. We're going to keep getting these kinds of tropes reasserted and reinvented that are debating whether or not black men should be there in the first place. And I think that's a new question. The reality is that black men, like any other group of people, serve a function in black communities and black homes. And that only becomes negatable. It only becomes debated within a racist society that has an antagonism specifically directed at the existence of black men more generally.
I want to pull some data up real quick because to your points that you just made, this is some data from the CDC. Most black fathers actually live with their children, far more than who don't. And whether they're living in the same home or not, black fathers are the most involved with primary recorded race and ethnic groups.
Hmm.
A report released in 2013 by the National Center of Health Statistics found that black fathers are more involved with their children on a daily basis than fathers from other racial groups. For instance, among fathers who live with their children, 70% of black fathers say they bathe, diaper, and dress their children every day, compared with 60% of white fathers and 45% of Latino fathers. Nearly 35% of black fathers who live with their young children say they read to them daily, compared with 30% of white fathers and 22% of Latino fathers. These are from Think Progress, and more than a third of black people live in households headed by married couples. This is from Pew Research from 2022. Um, Before we move on, do you have time to do a brief Q&A?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. We got some old friends of the space coming back through. We got some new people. Most of you, I don't have to say this, but the rules here are this is a Q&A part of the conversation. We do not need a soapbox. Ask a question, and then we'll move on so in case other people want to come through. First person up is Tony Gaskew. Tony, how you doing this afternoon?
I'm doing fantastic. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Loud and clear.
Great. Hey, Tommy, how you doing this afternoon?
I'm doing well, brother. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. Incredible lecture and information, Tommy. Um, my question really is getting to the point. You know, in 1959, the CIA commissioned a research report on Black American life, and it was headed by Gloria Steinem. It was called a review of Negro segregation in the United States. And it was basically
Hmm.
uh, a vulnerable assessment of what Black American life was like, just sort of a prodding for psyops. And we talked about the Moynihan report. My question is, what is it about the Black Academy that simply can't grasp that empiricism is important and that it's our obligation to just look at the facts and not look at the feelings?
Man, So that's a great question, man. It's funny, I was actually having the same conversation with a colleague out here. Um, well, I think there's a historical way of looking at this, right? So, when you look at Fraser's argument about the failure of the Negro intellectual, he talks very clearly about the difference between um, the African intellectual who looks at what colonialism, enslavement, et cetera, took from their people, and then the Black intellectual, which looks at what it's cost them not to exist in the same realm as white people because of discrimination. And the Black academic class grows up from a middle class kind of ideology. And I think part of that's aspirational, and I think the other part of it is based in survival, right? Um, and this is one of the reasons I really like Sylvia Winter, because she criticizes the Black Academy as a class, right? She doesn't just pick out the ideologies. I mean, she has lots to say about Black feminism, which I agree with as well. But she also is trying to point out how we operate. So it's like you say, listen, I teach the reason it's funny you mentioned that report by Steinem and the Information Revenue Service. I actually teach it in my Radical Black Philosophies of Race and Racism class here, and people are shocked that Gloria Steinem was authoring these kinds of reports that basically said that racism was over, that the Negro should be happy, and that America had provided many more opportunities for Black people to be productive members of society rather than turn to militarism than any other country in the world. So for me, the irony of knowing that report and teaching that report to my students is that on the one hand, you have Steinem as the grand feminist leader of the United States saying, hey, we don't have to really worry about racism. Black people are making gains. But then on the other hand, being championed now as kind of one of the major endorsers of Black feminism, saying that, oh, I've always thought that Black women were on the hedge or are the cutting edge of understanding feminism and this reality of racism and sexism. And you're kind of saying, well, look, which one is it? You said that Black people were fine, that Black people didn't need any kind of militancy, and then you come back and champion a movement that grows directly in response from Black militancy and dissatisfaction with racial inequality in the United States, right? Um, Black people are not thinking about, and I mean at large. I know that there's always exceptions. The Black academic class is not thinking about its own making. It is contemplating a reality based on ideology and an aspirational participation in white institutions and white systems. And when those institutions, systems, and ideological rationalizations fail, the foundations of that enterprise is questioned, which is why now you have a view that says Black academics really aren't that needed because there's no longer an audience. The primary conflict in the United States and the academy now is between the left and the right. It's a white on white violence situation. And because Black people really lack power, they don't have the kind of moral cachet anymore to influence white liberals to do the right thing because white authoritarians on the right are not listening. So I think the reason that they don't like empiricism is because their function in the academy has been one of ideological suasion and the moral consciousness of the white liberal, not necessarily an endeavor dedicated to the empirical material study of Black people and the ideological fallout from what empiricism exposes about their own methods and origin.
All right. Let's go to Ian. Ian, you got the mic. What's your question for Dr. Curry? Ian, unmute your mic.
Oh yes, I'm here. How you doing? Thank you for bringing me up. Yeah, my question is for the esteemed Dr. Curry. What do you think the impact? Because you did a video where you talked about how white women helped to create the white patriarchy. What do you think the
Absolutely, yes.
what do you think the impact then is where black feminists are saying that black men are patriarchs and that white supremacy is based on patriarchy and not necessarily the paternalism, which includes the racism and white supremacy of white women?
Yeah, well, two things. I think Black feminism has talked about the racism of white women. I just think that their analysis of patriarchy is ahistorical, right? So So and let me explain it this way. The arguments that we get coming out of black feminism often articulate one of the major boundaries between black women and white women structurally in terms of, well, the politics that white feminism advocate are not the same issues that affect black women, such as poverty, such as family orientation, or even experience, right? And secondarily, they have this issue about being isolated from the white feminist movement. So this is largely like Bell Hook's argument and some of the early work by Patricia Hill Collins, of course. Uh, I think that those two things make them different than white feminism. But my argument is that the class analysis of patriarchy that they assume about men has been incorporated from a position where they took on the racism of white feminism talking about black men, right? So in order for black feminism to hold two contradictory positions, namely that they say that their position as women is structurally different than that of white women, right? But then simultaneously hold that the structural conditions of black men may be different, but they aspire to be white men, requires them to do a little bit of finagling about what they mean by patriarchy. Because it would, remember, during this period of time, white feminists made the same argument about black women. They said that black women ultimately wanted to be like white women, right? This is Shulamith Firestone's argument, the dialectic of sex. And she's like, the only reason that black women ultimately turn away from white women is because they see white women as being weak, and they ultimately say that black women want to be white men. This is a traditional argument that white people had for all people they thought were inferior. They lived in this kind of narcissistic world where every race of people wanted to be them. The major argument that I'm advancing, on the other hand, is that because you do not look at the structural and historical position of black men from enslavement to the present, you mistakenly believe that they're men like white men and can possess patriarchy. This is an ahistorical rendering of how we think about patriarchy, both as having its origin in nuclear families, which throughout the 20th century, white feminists and white sociologists adamantly denied black people could have. And on the other hand, it's a contradiction in material and historical terms because black men have not sought to pursue patriarchy. What we have, because if black men were pursuing patriarchy, why would you still have all these black feminists saying, well, black men have failed in terms of family, black men have failed in terms of politics, black men have failed in terms of economics? There's a disjunction between those two claims. The patriarchy succeeds in nuclear families. It succeeds in political power and control. It succeeds economically and through industry. So that's the first problem. So then we're left with aspiration. And then black feminism says psychologically, they do this kind of pop psychoanalytic trope that every black man who raises a question or problem about masculinity ultimately just wants to be white men or have white manhood or patriarchy. So the issue is the disjunction between what they claim and the need to exclude white feminists from engineering patriarchy and producing patriarchs, to say that there's a function that black feminism produces as both correcting white women and sustaining the analysis of women in general being oppressed by men throughout the world. And I think that those tensions and the incoherence of the male category presents real theoretical and methodological problems for black feminism, which is what I was discussing in that I'm pretty sure I was discussing in that talk.
All right. Last question of the conversation. Let's get into what this removal of black men, this demonizing of black men, and this systematic removal of black men from households and communities does for us politically. I've said this a few times in other conversations talking about politics, that if you look at the way that political messaging is structured for every other group, there's an emphasis on economics, there's an emphasis on the family, there's an emphasis on what a political movement or what a political position or a political candidate can do to better your situation in those positions, whether it's stump speeches, whether it's rallies, whether it's
Hmm.
anything. For black people and black Americans, what we get is music. We get entertainers. We get the exact thing that Malcolm X warned us about in that conversation he had, where he said that entertainers and ball players and people who dance and sing and play the violin and trumpet players end up becoming our proxy leaders. No one else does that. Can you talk about how we got to that point and what the removal of black men has allowed that to happen. Because if you look at politics from the 70s up until maybe the mid 80s, there was a lot more seriousness when we talked about black politics and black political theory, even on talk shows, especially in political rallies, and even in from government policy and political rallies.
Yeah, I mean, listen. Um, Black people have always functioned as the sage of American consciousness. Okay. And listen, that's what you have going on today, even with the academy, right? Like, I saw a meme yesterday where, I think it was a refresh because I think I saw it before where black women were sitting on a building. It was an AI image and the world was burning and they were like sipping tea, right?
Yeah, I remember that. That
And
was
I,
after Kamala. That was after Kamala lost. Yeah, I remember
yeah,
that.
yeah. So, and there were no black men on the building with them, and I was laughing to myself because it's complete nonsense. Not in the sense, not just because black men also voted for Kamala at overwhelming rates, but because it points out this what I call this kind of sage ideology. The reason that the world's burning and what black women are sipping tea is because nobody's invested at this point in taking on that kind of intersectional consciousness of coalition building because there's no coalitions left. When white people are shooting other white people in the street, nobody wants to carry black people politically on their back because black people don't have collective power. It's the sad truth of the matter, right? White people are organizing to save themselves. Black people be damned. So
You know what?
what we have,
One thing that was funny about that. Now that you mentioned that picture that went viral when it came out, it's like
mm,
you have to have absolutely no understanding of the way warfare plays out in the real world and the brutality of warfare if you think you're going to be sitting on a rooftop in sniper range while the city's burning around you and nothing's going to come find you.
yeah.
There's
Well,
no
but listen,
there's no pre- there's no precedent for that in the history of human warfare where you're going to sit up there and be safe. But anyway, go ahead.
no, no, but this. I mean, look, but to feed off your point, right? This is why I say that. Why one of the things I've enjoyed about being in Europe is that you have the time to consider. You have the time to consider a problem and think about an answer that's not expected of you. And that creates a tremendous amount of earnest in what you do. In America, the ideas operate as if when you ask the question, you already know the answer because you know what's mandated from you by the academy or by the punditry. If you want to get on MSNBC or if you want to pick a war like a Guggenheim or a MacArthur, you know what you have to say about these issues. So there's not really consideration. There's really just repetition and performance of the time you think it took to give you the answer, right? The absence of black men in black communities means that politics will always be contingent because you're only operating with one half of the community. So what you've done is you said, listen, like every community, the black community has issues with poverty, it has issues with domestic abuse, has issues with child abuse, it has issues with homophobia, but only in the black community do those things not allow us to organize politically. Think about it this way: the white society and the conservative wing of the right society are incredibly misogynistic, they're incredibly homophobic, they're incredibly class-based, imperialistic and colonialist and nativist and every other word that you want to use, and yet they thrive. And this is the piece that I don't think black people understand outside of the confinement of the paradigm they have in the academy. Black people in the academy often think that we are somehow proving our moral worth for liberation and political freedom insofar as we can prove we are good. So we are constantly fighting each other to be pristine. We have no classism. We have no internalized racism. We have no homophobia. We have no X, Y, and Z. And then we're ruled and governed by people that have these ideas. That's not me saying we should imitate those ideas, but it's to say, does it really matter to the condition of the oppressed that the ideas that you're policing each other so closely for seem not to operate in any liberatory fashion? And they don't do that because they're white ideals. They're white ideals in the sense that they are trying to direct resources, both politically and institutionally, to white populations that fit those identities, be they women, be they queer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Black people deal with a completely different reality. So, regardless of what ideas or values we endorse as a people for inclusion about women, about the queer community, about the trans community, etc., we don't have the money to give resources to those communities. We only have to stand out the way so that white people give those resources. So, the absence of Black men is a functional part of the way that in which certain classes of white people, institutions, governments, etc., incentivize the Black community to rationalize their position as being imperiled by the presence of Black people. And we saw this when, at the end of the civil rights movement, when people started assassinating the character of people like King and X. We saw this at the end of the Black Power movement, where people claimed that Huey P. Newton, Eldridge Cleaver, all these people were sexual deviants, etc. We see this contemporarily with any Black person, etc. So, who are the people that give us comfort? The people who entertain us. Who are the people that demand at least the visibility from white people? Entertainers and sports people. So why do they become the leaders? Because that's who white people decided they want to listen to. Black people's politics are performances of opinions about Black people. They're not the manifestation of serious study, empirical work, scientific investigation, or inquiry. You have people with degrees in English talking about short stories to have the same kind or just as likely of an analysis as people that allegedly do sociology and social science. And the reason for that is not just because of how white people see us, but how we see it. We see ideas about Black progress as an ideological philosophical system that is rewarded by an external group of people. We don't necessarily see our endeavors as producing new forms of knowledge that contradict the ideologies or philosophical systems of external people. And that's the difference between, say, a Black male studies and what we do under Black feminism. The idea isn't to form coalitions with anybody because we're diagnostic. We're trying to figure out why these things keep repeating century after century, right? And you saw the same thing with Afrocentricity, right? When Ashanti and Carruthers and these other groups of people said we're going to independently study Black people, the immediate condemnation was that they were angry, they were separatists, and they were misogynists, right?
That's what
You have
happened to
like
Dr. Welsing too at Howard. She couldn't get
absolutely,
tenure no more.
absolutely, absolutely. So the all right, so the program is already set, brother, right? What we're doing, I was saying this yesterday. I was telling somebody this yesterday. Listen, because human beings' lifetime is so short, we have a terrible memory. We have a terrible memory about the techniques and the messages that are given to our people. We every generation we reinvent the same problem. We reinvent the same notions, the same tropes, the same stories, the same characters, right? Pretty soon we're going to be a century removed from Black Power, and people are going to still be talking about how Black Power is the political template for all Black political actions. That makes no sense. No other group of people says this moment happened in the 1930s. The New Deal happened during the Depression, and that's what every other substantiation of the white political idea was based on. But Black people do that. And the reason we do that is because we haven't been allowed to have a political imagination that supersedes the absence of our own people. We have to think about what other people want to hear from us. So they will reward us and give us scholarships and give us attention and give us shows and allow us to be pundits about the situation and the world that they've created. And one of the things about being outside of the United States is that you see that very clearly. You see very clearly that many of the problems that we talk about in the Academy are not actually problems, right? They're the interventions and the theoretical tropes that disciplines use to understand Black people. So the same way that in the early 1900s, the issue was matriarchal and female-led households, today the issue is toxic masculinity and Black patriarchy. And in 50 to 100 years, there's going to be something else that we make up about Black people. We're ruled through the mythology that we tell Black thinkers they have to think through. So the absence of Black men is just one of those. The concrete manifestation of it, however, is that we socialize communities, we socialize scholars, and we socialize the world insofar as Black Americans are concerned about Black American culture, to suggest that it's okay for them to believe that Black men are dangerous, that Black men are predators, etc. And this is why I criticize people like Bell Hooks This is why I criticize even some of the work, even though I like Patricia O'Connell. She's wrong about some of her arguments about domestic violence because that's what a scholar does. I don't say they're bad people. I don't misrepresent or misread them. I say they said X. Here's where they get it from. Here's why we should reject it. I'm not really a fan of Hooks. I think she does because I don't like how she does research. But you have people that are doing research that you just disagree with. Our job is to re-socialize our people against the mistakes that other people before us have made. And when I die, people will do that, right? It's how knowledge is supposed to advance. But because we believe so strongly that almost 50% of the population of black people, that black men are immoral and deviant and dangerous, we don't get to benefit from their perspective and experiences of life. And I think that's the tragedy, right, of our absence. That's why entertainers hold more cachet than scholars. And that's why black people find themselves begging for visibility and attention in a world that has shown us that black life and that black experience and voice no longer matter because it doesn't fit the reality that white people are interested in investing in anymore.
All right, I think that's where we'll put a pin in it. Dr. Curry, thank you for taking taking time out of your schedule to have another one of these conversations. It is always a pleasure and an honor to hear you speak.
No, thank you so much, sir. I appreciate it.
All right, this has been episode 10 of the Black Male Studies Sessions, Moynihan Report Revisited. We'll have the playback up for you in another hour or so, and it'll also be up on different platforms as well. So look out for that and check my socials so you can see that. And as always, Dr. Curry, let people know what you're working on and let people know where they can find your work.
Well, you can Google me. You can find my work pretty much anywhere these days. But I'm working on the sequel to The Man Not, so I'm hoping that'll be done by the end of the year.
Yes.
And I'm frantically writing a book that I hope comes out with Polity entitled "Myths Maketh Man," where I really want to tackle some of these rationalizations about black male death and the absence of black men from our intellectual lives. One of the things that I think people really miss about The Man Not is I'm talking about how black men are unthought, that we don't give them consideration because we revert either to bad data about them or we listen to kind of these psychoanalytic tropes that are advanced by feminists about how they desire patriarchy. And what I really want to do in Miss Make His Man is articulate the kind of interior world of black men, the material realities that they experience, and how we can gain insight from that.
All right, so everybody be on the lookout for that. Again, thank you for your time. Thanks to everybody in the audience who came through to listen, and thanks to the people who came up into the Q&A with some excellent questions. Um, Everybody have a good rest of the day. This has been Black Male Study Sessions, episode 10, Moynihan Report Revisited. Everybody be safe. Have a good day.